Right. The Book of Ruth is not a story where God shows up in big, flashy ways. There are no burning bushes, no parting seas, no angel choirs, heavenly messengers, or acts of resurrection. The whole book really just tells a rather ordinary tale, featuring rather ordinary people and their circumstances. Circumstances which, frankly, could be pulled from today's headlines. The Book of Ruth opens with the mention of a border crossing, a rather significant one for sure. Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons leave Bethlehem because of famine, and they move across a border to the country of their long traditional enemy, Moab. There the Israelite family settles down, and the boys find and take wives from among the Moabite people. Unfortunately, not long after that, Elimelech dies, and a short time later, so do his 2 sons. Now, of course, this alone is a tragedy and should be considered as such. Death of a husband and sons without even the guarantee of grandchildren left Naomi and her daughters-in-law in dire straits. And usually that's about as far as we take our curiosity. We make it to compassion or empathy, and we sort of stop our wondering there. But the early tellers of this story, the thinkers and rabbis over the ages, pushed a bit harder on these tender places. Wise and curious sages tried to understand how it happened that Elimelech and his family encountered such tragedy. How does a noble Jewish family, steeped in the traditions of Torah, disintegrate into nothingness? Was he being punished? And if so, why? And so the Midrash, remember I talked last week about Midrash being sort of these extra biblical writings. In the Midrash Ruth Rabbah, we hear some intel on what the earliest tellers and sages of this tale felt had some merit, some worth of note. Notably, that while Elimelech's name meant "to me will come kingship," he didn't actually act much like a king. In fact, when hard times came upon Bethlehem, when many were starving and in need, Elimelech did little to nothing to support the local town. He had been a leader, a provider in the community, both by virtue of his family lineage and his affluence. But when the years of famine came, he said, "Now all of them are going to come to my doorpost, each one with his begging cup in his hand." And so Elimelech arose and fled from them. So according to ancient Midrash, Elimelech abdicated his responsibilities. He abandoned his community in Judea, and because he had the financial resources to do so, he moved to greener pastures. And I'm sure he must have rationalized his behavior to his 2 sons and explained to them that it was for their welfare and for their benefit that he fled Israel. There was no way they could have helped everyone, so instead they chose to help themselves. Elimelech and his family took refuge in Moab, the country of their enemies, but clearly with enough wealth to be absorbed into the community. When Elimelech's sons came of marrying age, the Moabites had no qualms marrying off 2 of their eligible daughters to the foreigners in their midst. A move, by the way, that was scandalous, bordering illegal in Israelite law. But if Elimelech was able to abandon his responsibilities to the Jewish community, frankly, it paved the way for his children to abandon Judaism too, in their marriages to Moabite women. This whole thing is a slippery slope. So let's talk for just a minute here about the relationship between Israel and Moab. We need to do that if we're going to understand this book. To say it was a strained relationship is, frankly, an understatement. There is a memory preserved in the Hebrew scriptures about another time of hunger and distress. In Numbers 22, the Israelites recently liberated from Egypt, so think Moses and the Ten Commandments, the parting of the Red Sea. You with me? Right? So they're wandering about in the desert, following Moses, traveling through the wilderness on their way to this somewhere land of promise. En route, they end up making camp in the land of Moab. There is a reference in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 4, to a request made by the wandering Israelites to the local Moabites for bread and water, basic hospitality. The king of the Moabites, Balak, terrified by the sheer number of people he would be required to supply, refuses their request for aid and for shelter. King Balak even hires a man to pronounce curses on the Israelites as he expels them from his land. Bonus points if you can remember the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. To those to whom the story of Ruth was first told, this tension would have been obvious and cogent. It didn't even need to be explained. It just hung in the air around this story. The prejudgment of the original hearers is that in a time of hunger, no sensible Israelite would look to their neighbor Moab for help. Israel has a long memory. Or, as the old Scottish saying goes, close your ears if you're sensitive. Forgive your enemy, but remember the bastard's name. So, do you have a better idea now of our characters and our framework for this book? A wealthy Israelite family gets out of Dodge when food becomes scarce. They pack their bags and cross the border literally into enemy territory. For Elimelech, apparently, it was a better plan to live with food and comfort among your enemies than it was to share your resources with your own suffering people. That'll preach the sermon I know. He's saying amen. Don't worry, I'll translate. Upon arrival to Moab, Elimelech and his family demonstrate that their presence will not be a burden on the locals, and so they set up shop and lay down roots. They even marry into the community by both boys. Now they are tethered. But before children could be born to solidify the union of their households, the men of the family all die, leaving 3 widows, yes, but one of them was an Israelite. She is without protection and provision of her husband and sons. Naomi is in a very precarious position now. Moab is under no obligation to offer care and hospitality to a Jewish widow. She is in danger, and Ruth and Orpah, by extension, are not safe either. That is why, in chapter 1, she was so adamant that they go back to their families of origin. She cannot offer them protection or provision. She can't even guarantee that for herself. Her only choice was to return to Bethlehem without husband or children, without home, without money, tail between her legs. In Moab, she was a sitting duck. But turning her face back to Bethlehem didn't exactly guarantee much better. So knowing this, now we can sink even more deeply into the radical nature of Ruth's proclamation when she said to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people." In a reversal of Elimelech's choice to cross a border in order to leave hardship, to pursue comfort in a less troubled land, Ruth chooses to leave behind the comfort and familiarity and provision and care of her family and her community to cross a border by Naomi's side, even though it means crossing into her enemy's territory. Now, Ruth would be the foreigner, disdained, all eyes on her, her body a blank canvas upon which to hang all of their hate-filled histories. I wonder what they talked about as they walked the journey by foot. I wonder if they talked at all. I wonder if Naomi tried to prepare her daughter-in-law for the prejudice and racism she would encounter among the Israelites. Naomi had gotten to know Ruth and Ruth's family and her way of life, and had come to love her daughter-in-law with all of her heart. But the people of Bethlehem had no such relationship with her, and saw Ruth as nothing more than a foreigner, a stain on Naomi's already ruined reputation. Shame hung on them like a pall. So when Naomi crossed over into Bethlehem, the whispers were audible. Scathing glances as people recalled her husband's choice to flee the famine. Gossips finding sick pleasure in Naomi's toppling from privilege, now reduced to the saddest case. Serves her right. No money, no home, no husband, no children, and accompanied by all people by a Moabite. Talk about adding insult to injury. You left while we were in peril, Naomi, and now you come back with a Moabite on your arm? The scandal cannot be overstated, which probably explains then why, for the first 2 chapters of the Book of Ruth, and I would encourage strongly that you go home and read these in the scriptures. The first 2 chapters of the Book of Ruth, our protagonist is rarely mentioned without reference, double reference often, to her ethnicity. Ruth the Moabitess from Moab should drive all English teachers to run for their red pen. There's a few redundancies. But the repetition of her race was important. Ruth belonged to their enemies. Assumptions were made about her character and her personhood. And furthermore, Moabite women were caricatured to be overtly sexual. Now, there's a word for this kind of wrong thinking. On the softer side, we'd call it stereotyping. But it might be better to call it what it really is: racism. Ruth the Moabitess from Moab. Ruth is a stranger in a land with a long history of antagonism towards the land of her birth. Not only is she an ethnic stranger, she's also a woman in a man's world, a foreigner in a country that despises her sort, childless in a society that required sons, a widow in a family-based culture, and poor in a community that lacked a comprehensive safety net. Ruth is incredibly vulnerable. Listen, Christians have wrongly reduced the Book of Ruth to some kind of quaint love story. But that's not what it is. It's a book that shone a light on intercultural awareness for the people of God. By using ordinary people and their circumstances, the Book of Ruth holds God's people accountable. The covenant with Abraham and his descendants that being God's people meant being blessed in order to be a blessing, a conduit of blessing to others, to all nations. Well, that last part just too often got forgotten about. Now, we can give the Israelites some credit for having created and followed some laws and practices around caring for their most vulnerable. For example, one that comes up in this story is the laws of the field. You can read about it in Leviticus 19. It's a beautiful practice of leaving the corners of a field unharvested in order to provide for widows, orphans, and foreigners. But, does that kind of kindness extend to Moabites? This is a dispute. Ruth's race is a problem. Are you the right kind of poor or the right kind of foreigner? Was your marriage the kind that is approved of? If not, then you can't really call yourself a widow, can you? Why are you here, Ruth? Are you stealing jobs? Are you taking provisions we've set aside for our own vulnerable people? What are your intentions, Ruth the Moabitess from Moab? We should be getting a little uncomfortable, frankly. Rather than being a romance novel, the Book of Ruth asks its readers and hearers this tough question. Will you extend compassion, care, and security to the foreigner in your midst, full stop? Or will you let old narratives, old grudges, old stereotypes, even racism, get in the way of being a conduit of blessing and care in the here and now? The Book of Ruth is a reminder that new stories, new ways of thinking are always possible. And if you look closely, you might catch a glimpse of God in that. As we move through chapter 2, we encounter a bold theological act rooted in the possibility of new stories. Not ones told on the level of nation states or whole groups of people, but through personal and human one-on-one encounter, through chesed, God's loving kindness being played out through the interactions of ordinary people, people like you and I. And so in chapter 2, we meet Boaz, a relative of Elimelech. He sees Ruth gleaning the grain behind his reapers. And he's not stupid. He can tell she isn't from around here. And between the gossip flying around and a few pointed questions to his staff, he gets her full story. He speaks to her and encourages her. Notice he speaks to her and not just about her. That'll preach. He speaks to her and encourages her to continue to glean from his fields, but only his fields. He tells her to stay close to the women. Why? Because she is a Moabitess, and as such would not be guaranteed any compassion from other farmers, and as a widow, was easy pickings for predators, young men who saw her as less than human. When I was a teenager, I had a friend who was going through a tough time at home. And so my mom had him stay with us for a while. I knew him through the Pentecostal youth group that I was part of. One night, my best friend slept over. And when I wasn't in the room, the young man tried to be very inappropriate with her, asking her to do things she was not at all comfortable with and did not give consent. In a blood rage, I confronted him about it the next day. And he said to me, "Jack, it doesn't matter. She's Hindu. I'd never do that to a Christian girl." Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to harass you." He didn't have to say that, but he did. Boaz saw Ruth as a whole person, not as a Moabitess from Moab. He allowed her the dignity of work, safety in body, food for her belly, and kindness, loving kindness, chesed. Where is God in this story? God is in the one who chose to see past old grudges and calcified customs in order to see Ruth's whole personhood. And in doing so, a new story is written. A new scandalous narrative of grace and love, a story we still need to be reminded of today. I don't want to hear people telling me that the Old Testament or the Bible is out of touch. It's more in touch than most of us are, and definitely more in touch than most of our news sources. Sorry, I'm preaching. It's a story we still need to be reminded of today with all the borders, conflicts, and refugees that are still making headlines. Quoting Patrick Otuamai, brought his book in last week. The story of the world from its inception is one of migrating peoples. For millennia, people have moved across seas and over mountain ranges, empires, seized lands and created borders. With borders and empires came the idea of policing the permission to move. And the era of Christianist empires introduced the imagination that you only have to be in a country a few hundred years before you become the ones with the right to be there, policing other people who are seeking to arrive, as your recent forebears did only a generation or maybe 3 or 4 before. This book of Ruth is an intervention into that story. It doesn't tell people how to vote, nor does it propose a political policy on the question of open borders, but it does paint a recognizable picture. Someone has arrived in a foreign country, and she is aware of the hostility that she is facing. She has obligations, and she is faithful and good and kind to someone she loves who is full of grief. Yet she is not seen for who she is, but as the Moabite from Moab. Your people will be my people, Ruth says to her mother-in-law. But the question remains, will Naomi's people take Ruth as one of their own people? Ruth has no control over that. The narrator has us on the edge of our seats. But church, there are Ruths among us everywhere, every day, gleaning the edges of our fields, meaning that there are countless opportunities for us to be a Boaz, to choose to see people in their whole personhood. Where is God in this story? In the ordinary moments of human interaction, pregnant with the possibility of chesed, of loving kindness. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, it says in verse 17. And so the tide is turning. Emptiness is being filled. Hope is being born. I guess we have to stay tuned. To God be all the glory. Amen.